Welcome everyone to the last webinar in the Pan-Pacific Safe Communities Network webinar series for this year. My name is Tracy Earle, and together with my colleague Tanya Peters, we are your hosts for this webinar. Before we get started with the presentation, I'd just like to go through a few housekeeping matters. We'll have time for questions at the end, and we really want this to be interactive, so we encourage questions to be asked. Each of you will have access to the GoToWebinar control panel on your screen. If you familiarise yourselves with this, you'll find this useful as if you have any questions or issues as the webinar progresses. If you are having problems, just send us a message via the control panel and we will endeavour to resolve the issue for you. If you'd like to ask a question during the presentations, please type your question in the question area on the control panel on your screen. Or you may wish to put your hand up. To do this, you can click on the yellow hand on your control panel. At the end of each presentation, we've only got one presentation, sorry. At the end of the presentation, we'll have an opportunity for the presenter to answer your questions. If we don't get to your question for some reason, feel free to correspond with the presenter through the email, or you can send the questions to us. And this webinar will be recorded and will be available for viewing early next week. So today I'd like to introduce Dr. Garner Clancy from the University of Sydney, and he's going to talk to us about the impact of local crime prevention activities using real-life examples and including evaluation, collective impact, and the Safe Communities model. So I'll now hand over to Garner to further introduce himself and to share his presentation.
Okay, thank you. Welcome to this webinar and thank you for joining in. Thanks also to Tracy and Tanya from the Pan-Pacific Safe Communities Network for organising the webinar. Okay, before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of country, the Gadigal peoples of the Eora Nation, whose land upon which we meet, or I sit today. As we share our knowledge, teaching, learning and research practices, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. Okay, just a little bit of background and to talk about the work in particular that is shaping this discussion. So I've been interested in local crime prevention activities for a number of years, into decades now. And today's discussion will focus on some findings from two research projects in particular, which I think raise important challenges for work in this space. Some publications, those that are highlighted, capture some of what I'll be discussing. I'd also like to give a shout out for the Education for Justice initiative of the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime. I contributed to the tertiary module on crime prevention earlier this year, which is part of a series of modules that can be freely downloaded and used. So I'll include have included the link in my. What I want to talk about is a couple of projects and reflect on a couple of projects that I've been involved in, focused on local crime prevention activities in recent years, and try and think about the implications that move beyond boundaries, geographical locations, and move beyond discipline. So I think some of what I'm going to say applies more broadly to areas of human service, public health, criminal justice work. So during the first project, I spent 18 months looking at crime prevention activities in a single postcode area in Sydney. During this time, I walked the area to become familiar with it. I spent time reviewing relevant planning and policy documents, learning the history of the area, and reviewing relevant crime statistics. I attended in excess of 30 interagency meetings, and I interviewed 15 local workers from diverse agencies and backgrounds. As part of this process, I used this typology of crime prevention, Tonry and Farrington's typology, that basically sorts crime prevention into 4 quadrants: criminal justice, which most people are familiar with, the work of police, corrections and courts in preventing crime. Obviously a blunt instrument because crime has already occurred for those agencies to be mobilised. The other quadrants of this typology really more relevant, I think, to local crime prevention activities. Situational crime prevention and its related crime prevention through environmental design is very much about reducing opportunities for crime. And we have really strong evidence now that situational crime prevention can be a very effective means of intervening in a variety of crime types and preventing future crime. Social crime prevention is probably what many people are more familiar with. This is sort of an approach designed to tackle the root causes of crime, so it can often include projects and programs that are focused on providing housing, providing welfare support, engaging with people who are at risk of future criminal behaviour, so thinking about risk and protective factors of children and young people. It includes ensuring that child protection systems work effectively to stop the drift from kids in the child protection system heading into the criminal justice system. And early intervention approach, I think, is now pretty commonly understood as being a really important space where we invest early, and often that means early in life, 0 to 3, 0 to 5 years, and provide as many structures within communities to prevent dysfunctional families, if you like, being created through negative parenting or poor parenting practices, inappropriate or harsh discipline practices within the family home, and those types of interventions designed to improve the life course of children and young people as they grow. So the research found that there is so much activity that could be considered to be crime prevention. It's probably not a surprise to anyone that's involved in this space, but by just actually focusing on a small area and mapping the number of activities, it was clear to me that there is a whole array of activity that often our literature, our crime prevention literature, doesn't acknowledge as existing, and often our governments don't truly understand operating in particular localities. So in the small area I was looking at, came across a range of programs that could generally be regarded as having a social or developmental orientation. There's an alternative school running for young people who'd been deschooled or at risk of deschooling. A relatively modest program, but engaging with quite at-risk young people. They would come into a youth centre 5 days a week, not full days of school days, but they would get tuition from education specialists, and the focus was very much on a problem-based learning model, which meant that kids were learning through their interests. It wasn't about just the curriculum imposed on them. There's also a vibrant series of activities on Friday and Saturday nights to engage local young people, to keep them busy, basically, and ideally avoid getting up to mischief in high crime times, which are Friday and Saturday nights. There was a program in the local primary school that was designed to help parents with their parenting responsibilities, and a host of other activities operating in the local area that have a direct or indirect crime prevention objective. Some of the programs that I felt that were never acknowledged in the literature or in anyone's kind of thinking about crime prevention in that location were self-help programs like AA and NA and other 12-step programs that people were coming into the area or attending those programs from the local area. There are also a host of situational and SEPTEB or crime prevention through environmental design related activities. Some of those involved really significant investment and ongoing funding from local government. So the area was always well maintained in the research period and continues to be, because local government invests heavily in waste removal and cleansing services. And that's often not considered in crime prevention literature, and certainly not regarded as sexy work, but as really important work. And as part of the research, I spoke to people in the depot, this local government depot, about their activities, and they had such wonderful insights into the dynamics of the area by virtue of waste. They could tell you if there were more people living in particular public housing estates than should have been because of the amount of waste. They were also very keen to make sure that the area was a clean, safe space, so they did a lot of stuff above and beyond what they might be required to do. An important part of the kind of fabric of crime prevention in the space was how clean it was. But there are also safety audits and physical upgrades on the back of community safety audits There are a number of local murals that were funded by an insurance company to try and reduce graffiti in the area. The council has planning controls to approve or reject new planning developments. Alcohol-free zones operate in the area and operate, in many parts of this country and other countries. There's a program that was instituted to reduce crime in schools. So a number of schools received upgrades to fencing, and the school in the local area that I was looking at was a recipient of that program. So it kept people out, reduced arson, reduced theft from schools, made it a safer schooling place, and a host of other kind of measures in the retail theft area and private security. So a lot going on, but very little evaluation, which is kind of the heart of what I want to talk about really, is the volume of activity and the limitations of our activity because we don't evaluate well or frequently. And so one of the interviewees said, look, there's a swag of programs happening, which is exactly what I found. But they said they don't really know how they're evaluated. Many of the programs have run for a long time, but we don't really have any insight into the effectiveness. And that has been an experience in lots of areas, in lots of research related to crime prevention. We just don't do this work nearly enough. And my argument is increasingly that leaves us vulnerable. In the movement that I'm seeing in outcome-based funding that has been driven by Treasury agencies, certainly in this country, government dollars are increasingly requiring some notion of return on investment or some kind of impact measures. And I think in this space, there's a lot of room for us to improve. I'm not the first to say it, and I won't be the last, but I do think it's an important time for us to really consider about how we think about evaluation, how we measure impact, and how we sell the benefits of programs that many of us have seen be successful, but often don't reach the level of well-documented, well-evaluated literature that keeps the government interested. So I started toying with this idea of collective impact and the importance of collective impact. Probably not a concept that is unfamiliar to you, but one that I think is really important in this kind of current era. I think it's really important because collective impact talks about collective impact. It says that a single program, a single agency is not responsible for outcomes, that we have to think about the relationship between multiple service provision and any future impact or outcome relating to a person's life, a family's life, or a community's existence. Too often, in my opinion, evaluation ends up being about a really thin, narrow conceptualization of service delivery. So, for example, how did one program of that agency bring about particular impacts? I think that's incredibly limited because invariably what I saw through this research was clients moving in and out of different agencies, families being serviced by a variety of agencies, and the ultimate outcomes that all agencies were working toward really required that shared contribution. The other reason why I think collective impact movement and literature is important to engage with is it really valorizes this notion of backbone support. And I increasingly worry that funding just goes into service delivery. It doesn't go into supporting service delivery and coordinating activities. In the area that I was researching, it was really clear to me that they thrived as a result of having backbone support agency. In effect, it was a group funded by Sydney University, but it was a very helpful driving force to bring people together, to help them share data, to help them think about collective, collective impact of their work. What are we all seeking to achieve, and how do we do it better together? So that raises some important questions, I think, in relation to evaluation, but also collective impact. The second project is one that is a really modest project, but a colleague and I were interested in looking at a number of crime prevention plans for one local government area in New South Wales, in Sydney, over what is now a couple of decades, to see what had changed. what were the obvious themes coming up from these different plans that are often developed every few years. So we got access to documents over about a 20-year period in this local government area, and what was very clear was that it was an area of priority for the council, and that was a great thing that the council continued to show leadership. But there were some kind of slightly worrying trends when we put these documents and compared them back to back. Ultimately, it seemed to us that there were big changes that were occurring in crime, in particular, really significant declines in crime that didn't really seem to impact on the planning process, and that struck us as perhaps slightly odd. There was also quite significant demographic change in the area that for us meant that there was probably a need for some really different types of strategies and responses that also were not necessarily very clear in the plans. And reiterating the point I've already made, there was little or no evidence of evaluation or commentary on the impact of the array of crime prevention measures. So we kind of continue to perpetuate activity in this space, but not necessarily with a sense of kind of evidence or success of its impact. That increasingly leaves us vulnerable in an age of outcome-based funding. So many people are familiar with the different types of evaluation process and impact evaluation, and I'm not going to rehearse them here, but simply to say we need to be doing more of both. Process evaluation looks at how we did the work. Impact evaluation looks at was there any demonstrable impact of the activities we put in place. So in summary, some key observations. There's a whole lot of activity operating that could be considered to be crime prevention. And many of those programs and initiatives don't have crime prevention as an objective, but quite legitimately contribute to the prevention of crime in an area. But unfortunately, very few are ever evaluated or even comprehensively documented. So the lack of documentation means we just don't have a very strong understanding of the activities that many of us are familiar with because we've operated in these spaces for some time. This ultimately undermines crime prevention efforts, especially in an era of outcome-based funding, as I've mentioned. So I believe that we need to build a practice base, document what's happening, that should ultimately contribute to an evidence base, and that we need to employ a collective impact framework to acknowledge that the outcomes are a result of shared effort. So just two quick things to conclude. One is this notion of thinking about a practice base, and that basically means agencies have to be better at documenting the work that they're doing and sharing that work. I know that the New Zealand Safe Communities Foundation and Pan Pacific network are really strong in disseminating information from locations, and I encourage that and support that. I think we all need to be doing more of that. Then I think we need to think about realist evaluation frameworks, looking at what works for whom in what circumstances, and being better at writing up our programs. Independent evaluation is the ideal, but independent evaluation often comes at great expense. I think we need to just be honest that not all programs are going to be independently evaluated, and get on with the work of documenting what we have done and legitimately attempting to think about how we did it and what impact it's had, and writing that up routinely and sharing that routinely. And then ultimately, hopefully that feeds into an evidence base that's more reflective of the practice that I've seen through my research that I think is often missed when you go to an evidence base. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with Emmie, which is a clearinghouse of literature on crime prevention, I just want to make mention of Emmie. It's out of UCL, and the reason I like Emmie, which stands for Effect, Mechanism, Moderators, Implementation, and Economic Cost, is that there is a focus on implementation and cost. Too frequently, I think that's missing in our literature. We don't dig into the difficulties of implementation well and think about whether programs are transferable or not. And we don't often see much regard for the cost. So if we've spent a modest amount and got a modest return, then that should be acknowledged. If we've spent a substantial amount of money and had a modest return, then that's important information, because it might tailor whether we think that we would replicate that program on a grand scale or just apply it locally. So they're my comments. They're probably not earth-shattering or particularly new, but I think it's really timely just to reflect on the importance of doing this work. It's laborious to document. It's often time-consuming, but I think in the era that we're in, where I just see a kind of never-ending focus on government saying, how do we know what we got from the money we spent? If we don't get better at this, then many of the programs that we're familiar with and we believe are successful will just go by the wayside. So I hope the provocation helps to stimulate some activity in this area, and I look forward to seeing a whole lot of more documentation about the local crime prevention activities and safety activities that you're involved in. Thank you.
Thank you, Garner. Certainly some good messages there in your presentation. Now we've got time for a few questions. Does anybody have any questions?
Yes, we have one from Michelle. I'll just unmute you, Michelle, then we'll go to you, Wayne. Go ahead, Michelle.
Oh, hi there. Hi there. Thanks, Garner, for your presentation. Really useful to hear what often we see happening in the local area. We're based in Napier, New Zealand. I just wondered if you see any role for the results-based accountability RBA framework in measuring collective impact.
Absolutely. And I know different localities, governments have adopted different frameworks. So we seem to have a bit of an incessant focus on program logic models here, which has got people scurrying around developing very big, complicated tables. I think whatever model you adopt, whether it's RBA or program logic or related models, I think they're very useful in demonstrating the relationship between activities and potential outcomes. And it's often very difficult in this space to draw a direct relationship with what might be a really higher order objective. So often the task for crime prevention is to demonstrate the non-occurrence of some future event. That's tricky business. So being able to demonstrate the reduction in risk factors is really helpful. Being able to demonstrate how a series of programs have contributed to the reduction in particular risk factors.
I think we've lost them.
Garner, can you hear us? Because I think your microphone seems to have disappeared. Hello, Garner. We seem to have lost Garner there in the middle of his flow. Wayne, I also noticed that you had a question. Well, email those questions through and perhaps we can organise a time to speak with him, because he does not appear, his volume appears to have disappeared.
Okay, so we'll finish the webinar there. Sorry we couldn't go back answer those questions, but we'll endeavour to do that afterwards. So on behalf of all participants, I'd like to thank Garner for taking the time to share with us today. And just a reminder to those of you that have listened in, could you please fill out the survey for us on this webinar? That'll come up when we close it. And just a reminder, the recorded link will be available. The recorded webinar link will be available next week through our website. We'll let you know when that's available. So we hope you found the webinar useful today, and thank you everyone for your time.